The scenes unfolding in Israel this weekend were horrifying. 800 Israeli civilians. We could talk sometime about the larger geopolitical situation with Bibi Netanyahu, who's a criminal, but this is not the time, and this has nothing to do with that. So I'm going to toss it over to Dan Perry, very knowledgeable, lives in Israel, so you have some more insight on what's going on there.
The stories that are coming out are just scripted for absolute, complete, and total horror. It's indescribable. You have families burned to death in their homes, little girls making calls saying they killed my father and I'm hiding with an axe in the safe room and come rescue me. I have written consistently and publicly criticized the occupation of the West Bank and Israel's policies vis-a-vis the Palestinians. My quibbles with all of that is never ending. But that's in a realm of politics and strategy. This is terrorism of a nature that I've heard called animalistic, but that honestly does a disservice to any animal I've ever met.
What are your sources expecting the next week to look like?
There's more than one scenario. I'm not sure they've decided. A lot of people expected a ground invasion of Gaza the very first day, but that is complicated. I don't think they're ready for it. To do that and to minimize the likelihood of cataclysmic levels of casualties on both sides, you got to prepare. And I'm not so sure they're prepared to do this with a 24-hour turnaround. And even if they decide to, whatever the preparations, it's going to be very ugly, and that requires a lot of political will and a willingness to risk these hostages being executed. So I don't envy the people who now have to decide. Its goal is chaos and harming Israel. They care not a fig for their own population. Indeed, I'm pretty sure they're happy when there's collateral damage, as we say, because that gives them points in public and global PR. So I'm assuming they would invite an Israeli attack upon Gaza. It's clear that they're highly motivated by getting back the prisoners who are in Israel. There's many hundreds, maybe a couple thousand. Some of them are hardcore terrorists, and Israel does not want to release them. So they're gonna bargain as hard as they can. One already hears reports as we speak of a probably Qatar-mediated notion of Hamas releasing the women and the children in exchange for the women being held in Israeli prisons. That would make a lot of sense from their point of view. And of course, further complicating the equation is the extreme likelihood, I don't want to speak of certainty, but extreme likelihood that among the hostages are foreign nationals who are dual nationals, including US citizens. So that's going to bring in other countries. That's going to create media interest in those countries, which is what they want. There had been a conception in Israel that it could be contained. That conception has been shattered in a way that is worse than 73. In 73, yeah, Israel was surprise attacked by major armies backed by the Soviet Union, and it ultimately prevailed. Okay, here, Israel was unable to respond effectively quickly because this government, in its recklessness, had other goals than protecting the people around Gaza. They thought that Hamas would never dare do anything like this, even though these guys put out videos saying they would and showing how they're training for it. Instead, to satisfy the hard right in the Israeli coalition that wants to annex parts of the West Bank, expand Jewish settlement, which has the effect of creating a binational state that isn't Jewish, but they're too dumb to see it, and protect extremist settlers who run around legitimately terrorizing the Palestinians. That required much of the army to be in the West Bank, about 7 times, I believe, more manpower in the West Bank than on the Gaza border, to protect extremist settlers whose actions are a disgrace to the Jewish people. So these are the choices they made. And there were obviously a series of failures. There was a version of an intelligence failure, though I do believe that there was intelligence, but clearly wasn't taken seriously. The lines of defense around Gaza were abandoned to a few posts that were sparse and were overrun, and there was no second line of defense, and there was no quick plan to move in there, not even with drones and helicopters.
Israel has now clearly exhausted its approach in Gaza ever since the Hamas takeover 17 years ago. How can Israel avoid adopting an approach to Gaza now that won't become another strategic trap?
If Israel ends up occupying Gaza, which would be a really bad thing, the answer to your question is pretty simple. For God's sake, keep it a military occupation, as benign as it can be and as short as it can be, for as long as it must be, as opposed to doing what Israel has done in the West Bank, which is one of the stupidest things I've seen a country do in recent history, which is to populate it with Jews and Jewish communities throughout for the express purpose of making a partition impossible, where if a partition is impossible, then half your country will not be Jews, and you want to be the Jewish state and also a democracy. No more Jewish settlements, I would say, is the way to handle that. But in no way does that idealize the region of Gaza. Israel's pullout from Gaza was necessary and smart. What wasn't was acquiescing to, and really in a plausibly deniable way, encouraging the rule of Gaza by fanatical terrorist maniacs who are going to oppress their own population, revel in the destruction that they might bring upon them, and are dedicated not only to the destruction of Israel, but to nihilism in general.
There's a possibility that Hamas did this without direction from Iran. We have to hold that possibility open. What are you hearing, if anything, with Iran and the thoughts about Iran's involvement in this?
I do not think Israel's going to attack Iran or take any action against Iran that's significant unless they can prove Iran ordered up this action. If yes, then that's a different story. Might Iran not have encouraged them? I do not know. I don't think Israel knows. Maybe if they have intelligence, they haven't made it public and I haven't heard. But it's reasonable to speculate that Iran and the Palestinians both took a look at what seems to be going down, listened to Emir Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia, got the impression that he's willing to do a deal with Israel largely because he wants a security pact with the US and a domestic nuclear program acquiesced to and even organized by the US. And so much does he want those things that he's willing to basically drop Saudi Arabia's traditional demand that any deal include a two-state solution, or at least very significant steps towards it. You could argue selling the Palestinians down the river. Iran does not want to see Saudi Arabia thusly strengthened with a domestic nuclear program, with an alliance with the US, with an alliance with Israel, the little Satan, with Egypt being part of the equation. That really isolates Iran. They clearly don't want this.
I just have a few things to add when I've talked about what Azerbaijan has done in Armenia, talked about what Russia has done in Ukraine. Civilians are civilians, and they should never be harmed. It is a war crime. And Netanyahu and Israeli leadership may be awful, but what Hamas just did is a war crime. It is indescribable how evil they are, and they should be literally destroyed. Second, they're supported by Russia, and they're supported by Iran. Gee, who was it who tweeted out an image that we had of classified image of an Iranian rocket center? That's right, that was Donald Trump. Who was it that had all of these documents in the shitter with him? All these documents, many of which, by the way, we know were about Iran and Israeli intelligence. That was Donald Trump. Who invited the Taliban to Camp David? Who let 5,000 Taliban prisoners go? Who sat in the Oval Office with Lavrov and Kislyak and those guys, the top Russian spies here, basically hiding as diplomats, and told them so much about an Israeli secret op that the Israeli IDF and Mossad were so worried they'd to pull somebody out they had deeply embedded in ISIS. There is simply no doubt that Donald Trump, if anyone, gave the kind of information, the Israeli intelligence, to Hamas, Iran, and Russia to do this, that it was Trump, who is Putin's stooge. So when they try to blame Biden, ignore them and think about everything that I just said.